Greetings everyone, this is my first video in a series on occult theory I have amassed during the past years, and now I wish to share it with the world. In this video I will talk about the Tetramorph, the Sphinx, the vision of Ezekiel, the bull, the man, the lion and the eagle. This is a very common motif in the occult, and since this symbol appears in the Bible, it is indeed a very key element to understand for any alchemist or occultist. But before I talk about this specific motif, what we first have to understand is a synchronistic view of reality, which is that the vision described in the Bible is not purely biblical, but it appears in many other systems as well. Let's start with astrology. Any of those who know Western astrology will know that the bull is Taurus, the lion is Leo, the eagle is Scorpio. The spiritual evolution of Scorpio is usually described as going from the paranoid and highly primal scorpion to the eagle who's able to see everything from above. And then the final evolution of Scorpio is the phoenix, who's able to die and be reborn again and again. And then the man is Aquarius. Now in astrology, all of these four zodiac signs are of the fixed modality. So every zodiac sign has a modality. There are cardinal signs, fixed signs, and mutable signs. To understand what this means, we can look at Hindu cosmology. In Hinduism we have Brahman, who is the creator of all creation. Then we have Vishnu, who sustains the creation. And then we have Shiva, who is the destroyer of the creation. We see the same parallel in astrology, where the cardinal signs are the creator signs, the fixed signs are the sustaining signs, and the mutable signs are the destroying signs, or the Shiva signs. In astrology, zodiac also has its own element. So Taurus is of the earth element, Leo is of the fire element, Scorpio is of the water element, and Aquarius is of the air element. So what's being represented here are the four elements. Now the idea of the four elements goes back much further than the Bible. I think the earliest depiction of this idea is on the shamanic medicine wheel, or the shaman wheel. The shaman wheel depicts the four directions as well: south, west, north and east. In the most common shaman wheel, you start at the south, where south is of the water element, west is of the earth element, north is of the air element, and east is of the fire element. Then you also have a fifth element, which is the void, ether, the unknowable, the divine. It is simply more common to talk about the four elements since they are visible and tangible, and they correspond to the four cardinal directions and the four seasons as well. The exact placements of the elements relating to the directions are not always set, as different traditions have done differently. For example, in Golden Dawn traditions, such as the lesser ritual of the pentagram, the four archangels are invoked to represent the four elements and the four directions. Then the fifth element is the direction of above, which represents God, who is all-seeing and can see everything from above. But here the elements are not configured in the same way. Fire is south, water west, air north, and earth to the east. However, there is always the fifth element, which is the mysterious invisible element. Therefore, we really have 5 elements. In some systems, like in China, you do use the 5 elements. Models using the 5 elements will then create a pentagram, which is symbolic of man, humankind. The 5 parts of the pentagram represent 5 limbs, the 2 legs, 2 arms, and then the head. This is why 5 and the pentagram is symbolic of man. However, there also are more complex versions of the shaman wheel, where we include all 8 directions. This would include southwest, which represents the dream and the notion that you create the world through your thoughts. Northwest represents the rules and laws which regulate you and you cannot change. Northeast represents the higher and lower self. and your energy body. Southeast represents your true sense of self and the circle of foxes, where the end meets the beginning. The cardinal direction of south has the animal of the snake, represents feeling, emotions, water, plants, the past, and giving. The cardinal direction of west represents the jaguar, which eats and consumes, and then the consumed is reborn, represents knowing, the earth element, the physical body. It represents the now, this moment. It represents holding. The north has the animal of the hummingbird. It represents the air element. It is light and represents intuition, the mind, the intellect, and the future, and receiving. The east is represented by the eagle and the fire element. This is also the place of humans and sexuality and creativity, but this place is outside of time, and it is the place of action. The center is the ether. It is the eternal void, which is the place for our soul, and it is unchanging and eternal. The model using the 8 directions is more complex, but makes more sense. Here we are also left with the middle. We are left with 9 directions in total, where the middle is where we are right now. It is the self. This corresponds to many different systems. For example, in Norse mythology, we see the 9 worlds of Yggdrasil, and these correspond to the 9 planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. The reason the Kabbalah has 11 points, or sephira, is because you count the moon and the sun as well, so you get 11 points instead of 9. This also fits with the system of 9 chakras. We usually talk about the 7 chakras, but there are also 2 additional ones that connect to the universe and to the absolute divinity. We also see this motif in Luoshu, which is the Taoist system of divination and understanding the eternal rhythm of the universe. This magic square is the magic square of Saturn, which has deep occult implications, but that's a story for another time. In Kabbalah, we see the fire element being the most primordial element of the divine. It is the creation impulse of God and represents the archetypal world. This will then goes into the creative world of emotions, which is represented by the water element. These creations then start to take formation in the formative world or the mental plane, which is represented by air. Finally, the creation reaches materialization in the physical world of the earth element. The 5 elements also correspond with the 5 platonic solids, where the tetrahedron is fire, the cube is earth, the octahedron is air, the icosahedron is water, and the dodecahedron is ether. Here we see a scientific and mathematical reason for why earth and air has a duality. However, an interesting find here is that in most systems, fire and water have a duality. But this is not the case with the platonic solids. What we see here is that fire is self-dual, represented by the pyramid. It is the eternal oneness of the divine. What we see instead is that it is water and ether which has a duality. Robert James Moon was an American physicist who proved that all atomic structures are configured by the platonic solids. However, I believe the purpose of these models and these rituals are not to build an objective model of reality, but a subjective one. The medicine wheel acts as a map of reality. It acts as the journey which you must complete. Indeed, we see this represented in modern media such as Avatar, The Last Airbender, where Aang, whose name is named after the primordial or Ong, which is the sound of the universe in Hinduism, the most primordial sound of creation. When he masters the 4 elements, he's able to tap into the 5th element of ether, where he is able to connect with the divine and his true self. In the movie Contact from 1997, we follow a woman who receives messages from supposed aliens. The aliens ask her to build a machine which will transport her to their realm. As we see, the machine looks exactly like the platonic solid of ether. In the film, she is then transported to what can be seen as the afterlife, or God. We also see similar wheels used in Buddhism, for example, such as the Tanka mandala. Finally arriving at Christianity as promised, we can see that the 4 figures in the Sphinx represents the 4 evangelists and the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We might see a prelude to this in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where they represent the tribes of Israel. Here we have the tribe of Reuben to the south, the tribe of Ephraim to the west, the tribe of Dan to the north, and the tribe of Judah to the east. Following this model of the tribes of Israel, we will see that the lion is Matthew of the tribe of Judah, the ox is Mark of the tribe of Ephraim, Luke is the man of the tribe of Reuben, and John is the eagle of the tribe of Dan. However, I think this is a too technical solution. What makes the most sense would be that Mark is the lion, since this has more to do with how the evangelists describe Christ. Mark describes Christ in a very royal and majestic way, which fits with the lion, who is indeed a king of beasts. And the lion is very commonly used as a royal motif among royal families all around the world. Matthew is the man, since he focuses on the humanity of Christ as a human. Luke would be the ox, since he focuses on the sacrificial nature of Christ. And indeed, we see that historically oxes have usually been sacrificial animals in both paganism and Judaism. Finally, John is then the eagle, as he describes Christ in a very divine way. Indeed, this fits with the eagle being able to see things from above. It's also obvious, since a nickname for St. John is the eagle of Patmos. What's implied then is that the 4 Gospels describe Christ in different ways which correspond to the different elements. And when one has understood the 4 Gospels, one unlocks the 5th Gospel, which is the Gospel of Christ. It is the invisible one. A common name for Christ is Latenos, which means the hidden one or invisible one. Indeed, this is the element of ether, the element which connects us to God. This symbolism then continues later on in the Bible, in Revelations, where we see the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse. I believe that the symbolism is more or less the same here. The pale horse is that of the earth element, or the ox. It is one who is consumed by materialism and therefore dies. The rider on the pale horse dies as he is obsessed with the earth element and does not reach the eternal, divine. The black rider is that of the air element, and he is one who is consumed by intellect. The black color represents depression, which arises when one knows too much but has no love. The rider on the red horse is then the eagle, which represents emotions. Here the original shaman wheel, where the salt and water is colored in red, actually makes a lot of sense, and the connection is complete. The red rider is overcome with his emotions and anger, and he destroys himself and others. Finally, the white rider is that of the lion, the spirit, the fire, which is the beginning and the end before the final and first moments with God. The riders are usually portrayed in this succession, so this makes sense as well, as the earth element comes first, then air, then water, and then fire. In conclusion, the 4 elements are all necessary. You have to understand and connect with all 4 elements to finally reach the 5th element, which is the divine. I believe this is a universal motif which we see in many cultures and traditions. This is not a mere allegory, but reality. This is the reality of the alchemist, who understands that the elements are not merely physical, but are mental in nature, that the true alchemy comes from transforming the self from within. Again, I want to stress that the purpose of these models is not to construct an objective, universal theory. This is something that the alchemist uses for his own personal journey and understanding of the world, and for completing himself and completing the great alchemical work. The Sphinx is also a universal symbol which is represented in many cultures around the world. Both in Babylon and Greece, the Sphinx was a common motif which usually represented the union of opposites, of man and beast, the higher and the lower chakras. The Sphinx was also a mental gatekeeper of sorts. The Sphinx asked travelers of a riddle before they could pass. If one could answer the Sphinx correctly, the Sphinx would then disappear into the sea. This suggests that the Sphinx is an archetype inside the mind, which acts as a gatekeeper to the higher realms, which one has to pass through. This is not only done through solving riddles, but it's done through the combination of all the four elements, the union of opposites, being able to connect to higher and lower self, the male and female self. Once this process is complete, the gatekeeper is no longer needed and will disappear. So now I covered the basics of the four directions, the medicine wheel, the Tetramorph, the four gospels, and the 5 elements. As you can imagine, there is a lot more to uncover, but that's a story for another time. Now I ask you to use this information wisely, to contemplate it, and to make the journey inside and outside of yourself. On a meta level, we can take this concept of the 4 elements further. For example, what I'm giving you here is only an intellectual understanding of this model. In other words, what I'm giving you corresponds to the air element, that of the man, Aquarius. To truly understand, you will then have to use other means than just the intellect. For example, by investigating your emotions and how they correspond to the 4 elements. You do this via the lens of the water element, by working with material things and the material incarnations of the elements. You connect to the earth element. To do this, I would suggest to walk barefoot, swim, feel the wind and the sun on your face. What I want to suggest here is that you need to see several models and that they are all fundamentally the same. And that you also need to go beyond just models, but also understand through other means, through intuition, wisdom, emotions, and the material. What I want to communicate here is that all of these systems are complete. As I understand it, reality itself is already complete. These are simply different ways of understanding the same thing. Indeed, the 4 Gospels are 4 different ways of understanding Christ. In the same way, the Gospels are only one way of understanding. The shaman wheel is only one way of understanding. Physically connecting to the elements is only one way of understanding. So you must go beyond and expand this system to another level. And I hope that you can see that, for example, shamanism and Christianity is fundamentally the same. They are both saying the same thing in different ways. That's the whole point of this exercise. It's different ways of seeing perspective. The 4 elements all have their own lens of viewing the world. And indeed, if you look at the shaman wheel, you will see a cross. And this has been around much longer than Christianity. Now this could suggest that much of Christian symbolism comes from shamanism. But this is not what I want to suggest either. I simply want to suggest that all these systems are complete in their own way, and they all contain each other. I wanted to make this video as I believe I have more or less completed my journey, at least in terms of the elements. Although of course I have many other journeys to make and complete. Another reason is that we are facing a cardinal grand cross, which is a very special astrological event. Here we see the respective planets of each cardinal sign being in their home sign at the same time. Considering how special this year 2020 has been, this is just a cherry on top. Not to talk about the grand conjunction, which will happen at December 21st. This is also something I will talk more about in other videos.